Hello, everyone, and welcome to Art of Citizenry podcast, where we navigate the complexities of doing good in an unequal world. I am your host and in-house educator, Manpreet Kaur Kalra. Why does helping people who live far away feel different than helping those who live closer to home? From mission trips to building homes in remote villages, at what point does volunteering abroad do more harm than good? Anu Tharanath says it best in her book, Beyond Guilt Trips, when she writes, "Our travels to culturally and economically different locations often turn into guilt trips, precisely because we have little practice navigating the unequal power dynamics and different than meanness we find. We're not always sure how to think or speak about the differences we notice, even though these differences might have fueled our desire to travel in the first place. Those of us with more privileges and social advantages in particular might be even less practiced in recognizing and saying aloud what it is we are noticing and feeling about identity, race, power, and hierarchy. Simmering in our guilt and discomforting feelings about systems we have not created, but continue to participate in and perhaps benefit from, does nothing for justice." I recently spoke to a group of business school students about anti-racism and social impact. During the conversation, I noticed how most of them thought about addressing issues abroad when thinking about incorporating social good into their business models. This idea that those abroad are in more need of help than those living nearby stems from colonial power dynamics rooted in systemic racism. This podcast comes out of an Instagram Live conversation I recently co-hosted with Neha Sharma, an embroidery artist who creates South Asian and social justice-inspired art with a background in economics and public health. During the live, we discussed how voluntourism is built on a white savior complex, and how it truly isn't as altruistic as it seems, which sparked some really interesting conversations with our listeners. I'm joined by Neha alongside Lindsay Woodruff and Austin Miller as we continue the conversation and deconstruct voluntourism and mission trips. So with that, let's get started.
Hi, my name is Neha, and on Instagram I go by NehaxStitch.
Neha, I'm so excited for us to continue our conversation through this podcast. To start, can you share what made you interested in exploring the topic of voluntourism?
I first heard of this idea when I was in high school, and I saw a lot of friends engaging in voluntourism as a way to beef up their college application. It was very centered around themselves, promoting the fact that they were going on this trip by raising money from friends and family. And that was the first time it struck me that this is a little strange. They were raising thousands of dollars to fund their own flights and their own food and their own supplies to go to this other country to engage in whatever 1 or 2 week project that they were going to. Specifically, my mom actually said when we were donating to a specific friend's GoFundMe, my mom thought we were donating money for her to donate to the local community, not that we were essentially paying for her flight. And I didn't really understand how problematic it was until I was in college, working on my degree in economics, and I was also studying public health, where I started to understand the intersection of economics and outside forces engaging in smaller communities and how problematic it really could be. I did go to a Jesuit university, and so there was a lot of university or church-sponsored mission trips where, groups of kids and students would travel to a country in usually the global south, and they would have some sort of project, whether that's building a library or going over there and teaching English to children for 2 weeks at a time. And they would share very similar experiences to what I heard from high school, but with the added factor of them saying, we helped bring this community closer to God. And by God, they mean their God and not whatever religion the local community is engaging in. That was very reminiscent of exactly what the missionaries did, which is, I guess, why it's called a mission trip. And it's very concerning to me because it embodies a lot of that cultural and white supremacy that we saw back then. But it's so much more acceptable to do that these days under the guise of mission trips or even just voluntourism.
I couldn't agree more. I've said this in the past, and I'll continue saying it. Many mission trips and concept are and continue to be a manifestation of colonization. They reinforce power structures rooted in imperialism. And these similar notions of power feed into voluntourism. They reinforce society's normalized understanding of who wields power. I do think it's important for us to start this conversation by understanding the global north versus global south dichotomy. The term global south is essentially the new acceptable term used to describe third world or developing countries. Personally, I still feel this term is problematic because it implies this top-down power structure. But regardless, in 1980, former German Chancellor Willy Brandt proposed the Brandt line. Yes, super original naming, which is an imaginary line that divides the world map into the global north and global south based on GDP per capita. The visual of the map is the kicker. It's almost comical because the line basically goes across the map and then loops down to include Australia and New Zealand. I've included a copy of the map for your entertainment in the show notes for those of you who are interested in checking it out. Regardless, when looking at the countries that make up the global north, they are almost all countries that we historically consider to be white majority, ignoring indigenous communities on whose land we reside. Global south countries, on the other hand, are often tied to people of color. Most often, travelers going on do-good travels are from the global north, and they are traveling to countries in the global south that have been previously colonized and are still struggling to rebuild as a result of years of extraction, which continues today in the form of capitalism and even culture trips. There's a lot to be gained that is oftentimes one-sided and not two-sided, keeping power in the hands of those who have it and taking advantage of those who don't. I do believe that to unpack these issues, we have to first recognize the power and privilege we hold when traveling in an unequal world.
I agree. So, essentially this approach is coming from a time where, Europeans and North Americans generally white people believed that they had this so-called duty to bring civilization and God to these, so-called poor people or people of color who supposedly needed Western culture to become fulfilled human beings. And it's coming from a place of superiority where you think somebody could not possibly live in a different way that I do, and I need to impose my values on them.
Oh, most definitely. Colonization historically was built on the idea to conquer and convert. You conquer a country and then impose your understanding of religion, culture, and living. And I see these similar ideologies manifest in the way many approach voluntourism, may it be faith-based or not. The reality is many social enterprises or mission-driven businesses stem from these trips as well. Unfortunately, no form of economic exchange could possibly ever reverse the history of colonialism. While you might be able to create jobs, you can't bring back communities that were annihilated. You cannot unburn documentation of community histories, and you cannot bring back languages that are spoken no more. I think the truth is, unless we have an intersectional approach on how we think about economic development and how we think about building just economies, we can't create sustainable change. Sustainable change is about more than you, which is hard for many people to fathom. I strongly believe we need to ask ourselves one key question. What makes me the right person to address this problem? This want to be the hero leads to issues like heropreneurship.
I 100% agree. And I mean, it's all coming back to that whole savior complex that people from countries in the global north tend to have. And, I think a lot of the times the rebuttal to that is, okay, well, if you're going to criticize any way that we help them, then what's the point in helping them at all? And I don't think that that's the correct approach to have. You should be asking, why are you coming into a community that you are completely unfamiliar with, to a culture you have no ties to, and taking over whatever it is that they are doing? Any sort of initiative to, improve a community or any sort of initiative that they want to take needs to be led by that community, because that's really the only way that you can create sustainable change. I think also when you're seeing a lot of these companies that want to come in and create employment opportunities for people in, other countries because they've seen poverty for the first time or whatever, that attitude is very prevalent in almost everything that they do, and in obvious and not so obvious ways. And I think one of the lesser obvious ways, and this is a quote from you from one of your other podcasts, was when they come in and say that they want to empower the community. And yes, I think on the surface that does sort of insinuate that they are going to put the power back in their hands and it's going to be community-led. But that's not what happens in reality. Like you said, using that term empowering implies that the person on the receiving end is not empowered to begin with. That is, once again, people who have that savior complex coming in and thinking that they have it all figured out and we need to teach these people how to live our way.
Yes, the term empowerment is incredibly loaded and has become synonymous with voluntourism, social entrepreneurship, and nonprofits. And this notion of power often manifests from a savior mindset, one in which we think what we know is right without taking the time to first understand the community, culture, or systems we are entering and imposing our cookie-cutter approach on. Which brings us back to the question of, what does sustainable social impact look like? I do believe you need more than just business skills. I believe it requires collaborating with people within the community, systems thinking, and cultural humility. It requires understanding the local ecosystems, because what solutions work in one place don't necessarily work in another.
When you're asking yourself, what skills am I bringing to the table? I think it's not only that, it's what skills am I bringing to the table that don't already exist? Like, am I adding something, or am I adding any additional value to the conversation? And so, when we're taking the example, I think I said this in the live, when we're taking the example of high school kids going to some remote village and building a library, you're really telling me that these high school children, who it's probably their first time out of the country, can build a building more effectively than an actual construction worker. And you're telling me that then they are leaving that community with the infrastructure to continue to maintain that building. The $10,000 or whatever they've raised as a group to send themselves over there could very easily be applied to the local community or to an organization, like you said, that's already addressing the issue, and it would be so much more effective. I think when people are going on these trips, they need to be honest with themselves about what their intention is. I don't think there is anything wrong with traveling to see the world, with traveling to educate yourself. But when you start pushing yourself on the communities that already exist there, it's about you. You are not actually doing it for them, you're doing it for yourself. Yeah. And if you don't reflect on this, you're going to continue engaging in this problematic behavior. And on top of that, if you really don't think about the impact that you're making, you could very easily convince yourself that you are doing the ethical or you're making the right decision. And that's absolutely not true. I think especially with us, a lot of us are very privileged in the global north, and we have access to resources to help us do our due diligence to understand the impact of our actions and the impact of, more specifically, these voluntourist trips that we're taking. And if we're not doing that, I think you do not get to make the excuse that I had good intentions, because if you did, you would be researching as much as possible and trying to make sure that you're genuinely helping these people instead of going in and making it a very narcissistic experience.
One of the most notable examples of voluntourism going horribly wrong is the case of Renee Bach, which has been brought to the forefront by an excellent Instagram page that I recommend everyone follow called No White Saviors. Renee is an American Christian missionary who traveled to Uganda after graduating from high school and decided to start a treatment center dedicated to taking in malnourished children with extremely complicated medical conditions. She named her charity Serving His Children, no religious hegemony there. And this is the actual kicker. She had absolutely no medical training or qualifications, and in the process, we know at least 105 children died in her charity's care. And this brings me to our next point. I really don't understand why we believe the lives of people of color are less valuable than the lives of white children. Why can someone get away with this for so long before she's ever charged or shut down? What makes us think that a high schooler can provide medical care in Uganda when people struggle to trust a medical professional who looks too young in the United States? And I genuinely think that the reason so much of the savior mentality exists is because voluntourism gives people purpose. It fills a void and lets people feel like the hero under the guise of doing good.
And I think, again, that belief is very much rooted in supremacy and the savior complex. And it really, to really maximize your so-called impact, you do have to take a step back and say, are you doing what you're doing for Instagram so that you can post some pictures with some quote unquote ethnic kids and everybody's going to talk you up and tell you what a selfless and amazing person you are? Or are you doing what you're doing to genuinely learn, engage in a culture, and partner with them to improve whatever circumstances you think need improving? I think you're getting really to the core of the issue, is that these trips and these sorts of activities make people feel good, which is why they continue to engage in it without questioning it, because they think, if it makes me feel good, if it's on the surface doing good, then it doesn't even cross their mind to second guess what they're doing and to really do a little introspection and a little bit of outrospection and really understand what it is that they're doing, how they're contributing to a much, much larger issue, and if they are truly doing sustainable good, which really with voluntourism never tends to be the case.
And to me, this mentality is built on colonization, which continues to influence society's pervasive assumption that people of color need saving. And this brings me to a question I often ponder. Why does volunteering abroad feel so much more impactful than addressing issues closer to home?
The problems that people are going abroad to solve are very prevalent at home. And if you are truly passionate about, like your example, human trafficking, if you're truly passionate about, ending human trafficking, why aren't you starting in your own backyard? Why do you feel the need to fly all the way around the world and get yourself into a situation where you don't understand the nuances of what's going on there?
Most definitely. Human trafficking exists in every single zip code across the United States. However, if you were to search the internet or Instagram for human trafficking, you will mostly see photos of people of color in the global South. And part of that comes back to the value of life. We value the privacy of those here more than those in the global South. I also think that as a society, we oversimplify issues when we aren't living through them. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is this idea that problems we know less about are easier to solve. This is also why we see most of the people who get funding to try their hands at solving a problem or global issue are people who haven't lived the problems themselves. For example, unpacking systemic racism in your local public school system might seem so much harder than solving access to education in a Ugandan village.
Absolutely. And I think the perspective when those sorts of people are presenting the issues, you're seeing the Dunning-Kruger effect again. It must be very easy for them to oversimplify the issues if they haven't actually experienced them. And in turn, that very easily would convince a group of investors or a group of donors to send money their way because the solution seems so obvious and so simple to us.
This comes back to what we were talking about earlier regarding sustainable impact. We need to recognize we are usually not the first person to see a problem or try our hand at solving it. We need to think about what are the alliances we need to build and how we can best support the work that's already happening versus going in and trying to impose our own solutions. The truth is, good intention alone is just not good enough. Sometimes good intention can actually do more harm when executed without a thorough understanding of the issues we are trying to solve. The classic example of a poorly executed social initiative is, of course, Tom's shoes. Can you talk us through that example a bit?
It's so funny because, growing up, I think Tom's was one of the first brands that I had ever seen that was very outwardly engaging in this kind of social justice, social quote unquote empowerment for, these poorer countries who don't have anything. And so the whole business model behind Tom's is that you buy a pair of shoes and they will donate a pair of shoes to someone. I don't know who, but to someone. And it's the brand suddenly became so popular because people felt that if you buy these shoes, you are getting something for yourself, you're getting something for somebody else, and you are really passively helping the world. You are passively helping these people who don't have any money. They don't even have any money to buy any shoes. And so, it's very easy to get caught up in the marketing. It's very easy to get caught up in how could this possibly be a bad thing? But when you look into, I'm not even going to say economics, this is just basic common sense. If you are flooding a market with a free product, you will absolutely drive out any other competition. I think no matter how rich you are always going to be attracted to the free product. And so essentially what this did to the local economies was they were flooded with these free Tom's shoes, which, by the way, don't even remotely resemble the shoes that you buy in the store. They are a much, much cheaper version. And what they did was they ended up putting local shoemakers and local artisans out of business, because who in their right mind is going to spend money on a shoe when you're getting a free one from this, other company? And so what that ended up doing is it ended up putting people out of jobs. And then, eventually once the Tom's shoe supply stops coming in, who is going to supply shoes to these communities? And you ended up just creating more poverty and more people that need to depend on your free product, rather than just taking the profits of what you were going to donate, investing them with organizations or local shoemakers, and giving them the resources they may not have possibly had to help drive down the cost of their shoes, to promote spending in the local economy, to keep the money within their community, and to create sustainable change. But clearly that doesn't happen. And Tom's is not only the only example of this company. There are so many companies that have started following the same model because it's so popular, and it's easy free marketing, because people will talk about it and people will buy the product over another product if they think that they're doing good.
One of the things you alluded to earlier is taking photos while abroad with children of color for the gram. And that is not a concept unique to voluntourism. In fact, poverty porn, as I like to refer to it, has become a classic marketing tactic for mission-driven businesses. Tom's is, of course, no exception. They have their classic photo of their white male founder putting shoes on the feet of children that look like your classic poor kid in the global South, which I've actually included one of those photos in the show notes. But regardless, the issue with this is that it feeds into that single narrative, reinforcing stereotypes. White saviorism might be good marketing, but when navigating an unequal world, it does more harm. Another example similar to Tom's is actually Think's underwear. When they started, they were donating menstrual pads to girls in Uganda because they noted that girls in Uganda have problems with going to school while they're menstruating. So the automatic surface level solution appears to be pads for everyone. However, what that solution failed to do was actually unpack what some of the underlying factors might be that we cannot see on the surface. Again, oversimplifying the problem and solution.
Exactly. And to put that more in terms of like public health language, it's really going after the upstream factor, right? Are you going to address the problem at its root cause, or are you just going to treat the effects of it? And I think when we're talking about businesses, especially engaging in social justice or social impact type of work, it doesn't really work, because the bottom line is that a business's first and only goal is profit maximization. Anything else that they are doing is always going to lead back to profit maximization. Should these brands really want to create an impact, they are not going to be focusing their energy on a very capitalistic kind of organization. It's two completely separate goals that just cannot be brought together in any way.
Well, I do think there's some room for social good in business, but to assume that a business alone can make systemic change is absolutely naive. For example, when you mentioned that if Tom's took the money they used to create subpar shoes and instead invest it in the communities, that would have been more impactful. That is a form of social good. With that said, though, and to your point, my past life was in venture and startups, and impact investing is something I am always intrigued by, because investors do typically look for the classic profit markers when investing, and those same markers cannot be used to evaluate the profitability of an impact-driven business. They just cannot. The truth is, most brands that are dedicated to paying fair wages, sourcing responsibly, and minimizing their impact on the planet are not generating the same profit margins as your typical business model, which is why I think it's important to always remember that impact does not scale like a business. It just truly can't. One business alone cannot create sustainable change. You need to build alliances. You need to work within those communities if you truly want to create an impact. And if your intention is to solve a problem, that's how you solve a problem.
Exactly. And I think that businesses are never going to take themselves out of the equation because it's then taking away a marketing opportunity for them. Bringing that back to a voluntourism sort of context, you can scale that attitude down to individuals. And that is really the crux of the issue. And more people need to start doing their due diligence to understand the impact of their actions.
We've talked a lot about the layers of complexity around voluntourism and mission trips abroad when navigating an unequal world. Now let's bring it closer to home.
So in high school, our church was actually very afraid of the idea of sending children to dangerous countries. So we did a lot of mission trips and we did some with seeing urban poverty. So in New York City, and I remember the first one I went to was to Cincinnati, and that was like so big and scary. Yeah, I remember parents of other children talking about how like, oh, over the Rhine, like not even the police go there at night. And then I went to college in Cincinnati. I was like, this is not at all what I was told it was. And then also to like Appalachia, some more rural regions, working with communities living in poverty there. So, I grew up seeing, a lot of rural poverty, and white poverty, which is something that nobody ever talks about in the United States. But it's still very real. And then also, I think going to New York was like my first like big city mission.
That's the voice of our next guest, Lindsay Woodruff, the founder of Pachamama Market.
I am an entrepreneur and small business owner. I own a small brick and mortar fair trade shop in small town, Ohio. Before I started my business, I worked in the nonprofit world. I was a program director for a variety of nonprofits, but over about 10 years, I worked for a bunch of different groups. And as part of that journey, I went to grad school and got my master's in nonprofit management. And during my senior capstone experience, we did a study abroad in Peru and spent several weeks working with indigenous communities in Peru. And so through that experience and then several months and years afterwards, I continued to work with a group there in the Sacred Valley of Peru called Kusikasai, but their U.S. registered name is Pachamama's Path. And everything I learned and experienced during that time and to this day has profoundly impacted me and my worldview. And I wanted to honor both the Quechua people and their time and influence that they've gifted me with, but also Pachamama, who is Mother Earth. So I wanted to honor both the people and Pachamama with my business name. So they're in honor of her and the Quechua people.
One of the things I've heard you say in the past is you consider yourself a recovering evangelical. What exactly does that mean?
I was raised in a very evangelical faith community. Which is funny because neither of my parents really identify as evangelical, but the faith community we just kind of found ourselves in. And it's always strange talking to your parents as a child and then again as an adult about their faith. Yes, I was raised, going on missions trips and, having, purity, vows and all of those things that you hear about the evangelical community. But that's where I was raised. And that was the kind of the perspective and the worldview I grew up in. And now as an adult, raising my own children, I have a very, very different perspective of just the things that I was taught, that were what they considered to be truths. When I was a child, and now I look back and I go, wow. And in what world did I think that this was healthy for an adolescent girl to be immersed in? But, that's where I come from.
Can you touch upon your experience with mission trips? Where did you go and what did your journey look like?
So I went on one international mission to Guatemala City. And then I was preparing, I actually went through a training to become like a missions leader, and then was preparing to go to Tanzania. That was sort of when I had my like, wow, we need to rethink this moment, because I was so part of missions culture and churches, and we call it missions, but really it's faith-based voluntourism. But I think one of the big differences between voluntourism or missions and just going on vacation is you want to go see another country, but you don't want to pay for it. So you fundraise for it. And so I was fundraising for my trip to Tanzania, and everybody was supposed to raise, I don't remember the amount now. I'm pretty sure it was $4,000. Everybody was supposed to raise $4,000 to pay for their trip. And I was talking to somebody about the money we were raising, and they're like, how many people are going on this trip? And I said, I think about 12. And I said, what if 12 people just donated $4,000 to this orphanage you're all going to visit? And like, I don't know why, but like just that exact moment was when I went, wow, that would have a bit more of an impact than 12 people going there. So I think we were going to be building a soccer field for this orphanage, which like none of us had, landscaping or groundskeeping or, sports management, whatever. I don't know. I don't even know what credentials you need to have to build a soccer field. Like that's how unqualified we were. But I was like, that actually makes a lot of sense to actually just pay for people in Tanzania to build a soccer field. And then there was so much money left over to buy equipment and nets and, pay tuition for, families to attend the school nearby. And just, so that was sort of the beginning of the end for me and missions. And, I sort of went down this rabbit hole of learning and reading, like, why is this a thing? Why do we have people give us money to send unqualified people to go do what very qualified people who probably need the employment in these countries we visit? And so Jamie, the very worst missionary, she really was just such a wonderful educational resource for me, reading her blog about what would it look like if churches just stayed home and sent the money to go support these organizations that we were going to volunteer with or whatever instead. And her own experience was that she didn't speak Spanish. She did not have any kind of expertise or background or whatever, but was supposed to go live in this Central American country and be a service to the community. And she was like, what was I doing there? I don't know. But she was the one who kind of introduced me to the idea of, we should be investing our resources in actual professionals who are qualified to do these things and not just sending uneducated, unskilled people with money.
So what can make voluntourism sustainable?
Again, I go back to my experience when I was in Peru, because I was not there as a tourist or a volunteer. I was there as a student, and I was there to learn about, because I was studying nonprofit management. I was there to learn about how the nonprofit sector functions in Latin America, and comparing it to the way that our nonprofit organizations work here in the US. And it was an educational experience for me, but approaching them with the humility of, I'm here to learn from you, versus I am here to show you my white Western ways and how they're superior, was approaching it from a totally different mindset. I did do some volunteer work while I was there, but it felt very productive on both ends. Like, I learned a lot, but also the organization I was working with benefited from my time there. And I was there I did a board development plan for them. So I was learning about their programs, the way they worked, what was their impact, what were their needs. And then I created a plan for how to develop and strengthen their board so that they could have a better impact in fundraising in the US. But I was there at their invitation. I was there with their permission and their informed consent. And I was there to offer my expertise. And so, in my opinion, sustainable voluntourism always has to have elements of expertise and invitation. If I'm not there at the invitation of the community, then I should not be there. And also, I have to have some sort of expertise that is not available locally in order for my presence to even be necessary. And if I was there to teach them how to further develop their board in the US, so they could be more effective in their fundraising and leadership in the US, I had to have some sort of expertise in the way that US-based nonprofits function.
I agree. Traveling to provide help without first doing the due diligence of what help is needed in the first place, and really asking ourselves if we are qualified to provide that help, is part of the problem. I think part of the reason this problem exists is, at least in the United States, we're taught that we can do anything and to fake it till you make it. But this mentality can be so harmful in the context of voluntourism.
Right. And we don't talk about the fact that, like, okay, great, go volunteer for an orphanage in Tanzania, because you believe in what, your heart's in the right place, even if you're not a child development specialist or, a trauma psychologist or anything like that, but your heart's in the right place. So go ahead and go do it. We don't talk about the fact that even if you're not an expert, like, it doesn't matter if your heart is in the right place or not, you are actually inflicting damage if you are not, qualified to be doing this work. Because if you have a rotation of 12 adults going in and out every 6 weeks or whatever, I don't know how often, to go visit this orphanage, going and playing with the children and developing attachments and then leaving again, all you're doing is these are orphans. Like, these are kids that, either because of their parents' health or well-being or whatever, are no longer there. Or let's talk about the fact a lot of Western-run orphanages actually get their families to leave their children there, even if they are still alive, because that's, the financial situation that they're in. That's a whole nother issue. But all you're doing is teaching these kids over and over and over again that adults will always leave. And that is psychologically and developmentally more traumatic to the children than any good that you think you're bringing, no matter if your heart is in the right place. Like, if you are not the most qualified person to be doing this work, you are in actuality inflicting damage on the community that you're trying to benefit. And that is why this whole structure needs to be rethought.
Agreed. And I do think to make voluntourism sustainable, we need to talk about longevity. Going into a community and expecting to make sustainable change in the span of 2 to 3 weeks is naive. We have to give ourselves the time and space to first understand the community and society we are entering, approaching these conversations with empathy and humility. Actually, in episode 2 of this podcast, I spoke with Tanya Sesh of Multiply, and we discussed the importance of putting your ego aside and learning from the communities versus imposing your own assumptions on them. Sometimes in the name of understanding a community or a culture, people do these things called village visits, right? Where it's like, I'm going to go visit a local village and learn about their way of life. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is something that I really struggle with, and I need to spend more time with myself sitting with this issue, because we've talked about this before. And my problem is, I know that I have a bias because I genuinely love learning about people and learning about their everyday lives and forming relationships with people. And so for me to do a village visit, it's genuinely like, I want to sit down and share a meal with you and talk to you about, what you think of these things, and, learn about, how your perspective and values are different than my own. And so, like, that's where I'm coming from. But we talked about the fact that going and looking at another culture and their house and their family can be very much I'm looking at these, still lifes in a museum, and I'm like staring through the glass and going, oh, wow, you're so different. And it can be a very othering experience. And so I really struggle with this issue. I think on one hand, if you go there with the right intentions and it's a well-run program and people are vetted properly in their interests, I think it can be not only a great cultural exchange, but also I know a lot of families that's a good source of income for them, is hosting, homestays or overnight visits or whatever, or, cultural workshops, things like that. So on one hand, I've seen and experienced well-run cultural workshops where it was just a fun, great time to get to know people and learn some of their recipes. And, but it can also be a very, very othering experience. So, I'm selfish and I want to be able to do these things, but I can also see how harmful and damaging it can be if it's not done, with the understanding of my culture is not better than yours. I am not superior to you in any way. I'm here, with the genuine interest in learning and building a relationship with you.
I really struggle with the idea of permission or invitation, because sometimes that permission, at least I believe, comes from a place of pressure, not necessarily from an organization, but financial pressure. I struggle with village trips because I do think that they exotify culture, because you would never see a person say, I want to go observe how a middle-class family in California lives. You just wouldn't pay for that. People don't do that, right? But with that said, if you or I were to open our homes to people so they can observe how we live, we would vet the person before we let them into our home. We would run a background check. I feel like that same standard is not applied to communities of color living in the global South, out of the fact that they, quote, unquote, need the money. I think one of the main reasons why village visits rub me the wrong way is because they often simplify the complexity of a community's experience. They are curated and built around reinforcing stereotypical experiences, including wearing traditional outfits, as one example. I find that very unsettling, and it reinforces the idea that you can learn about a whole community's life in the span of a few hours or even a day. It reminds me of my trip to Cape Town, during which my husband and I ended up becoming friends with this woman and her mother while in the Bocap neighborhood, which is known for its colorful homes. They were standing outside their home and greeted us as we admired some of the homes and walked by. We asked them if they could tell us a little bit about how they chose the color of their home, and we ended up having this beautiful organic conversation. They invited us in, we had tea together and shared stories. It was an actual conversation. We didn't take photos because that wasn't something we were even thinking about, because to us, that moment was about just being present and learning from one another. We ended up becoming WhatsApp friends, actually.
Yes. And that's how, isn't that how they're always marketed too? Like, see everyday life in, whatever community you're going to. And it's like, but you're not experiencing everyday life in 3 hours. Like, how can you, how can you see, all four seasons of their farming cycle? Or how can you see the creation process of their weavings from, harvesting the yarn to spinning and dyeing? Like, how can you get that all in 3 hours? And it is a very Cliff Notes version of these communities where, you don't get the depth of understanding that you would, like you said, by going into their home and having a cup of tea and a genuine, real, unscripted interaction.
Yes, and I think so much of what makes these experiences prone to be disingenuous at times is our need to photograph everything. Photography, I personally feel, adds to the exotification. And part of the issue is these moments are captured from the lens of a person in power.
Right. So, I remember my sister-in-law is Chinese. And so when I was in China to go to my brother and her's wedding, we went to all of the tourist trap places too. Like we went to the Forbidden City, and then we went to the Great Wall, and we went to, all of the, architectural wonders of Shanghai and stuff. And in a lot of those places, like the Great Wall and the Forbidden City, there were people in traditional garb, and you could take their photos if you paid them. And I remember overhearing some of the other Western tourists there, like they were so mad. They were like, "Oh, why do I have to pay them to take their, like, all I'm doing is taking a picture, and I'm not, it's, they're here anyways in the sightseeing place. So I don't understand." Like they were offended that they'd be asked to pay. And I was like, why shouldn't you pay? I mean, this is their work. Like they made the effort to get dressed up and come out here, and that's their source of income. But it's this whole sense of entitlement to, I should be able to photograph and document anybody and anyone that I want. And it was like, no, this is their body. This is their autonomy. Why do you have a right to it? And it's that, it's that Western assumption that, like, I should be able to go anywhere and do anything that I want. And it's like, no, you can't. You can't go into someone else's culture and exert this sense of ownership over people's bodies. Is what, when you're photographing them, that's what it is.
This leads us to our final conversation, exploring how we navigate privilege and power when traveling or working in communities of the global South. In her book, Questions of Travel, Postmodern Discourses of Displacement, scholar Karen Kaplan writes, tourism arises out of the economic disasters of other countries that make them affordable or subject to development, trading upon long-established traditions of economic and cultural hegemony, and in turn, participating in new versions of hegemonic relationships. Or, as Anu Tharanath explains, these relationships are imperialistic in nature, forged by the mother country and her colonies.
My wife and I first traveled to Bangladesh as Christian missionaries with the Mennonite Church. And within our Mennonite tradition, we had this very focused zeal or idealistic. We wanted to change the world. And for us, that meant that people would become Christians. So going to Bangladesh with that idea in mind gave us a sense of purpose, and it was invigorating because there were other people there that had this same vision. And yet we tended to be frustrated. And over time, our relationships with people began to feel very surface level.
With that, I would like to welcome our final guest, Austin Miller, the co-founder of Kahiniwalla. Austin and his partner Marita work closely with Pebble Child, a fair trade enterprise in Bangladesh that creates hand-crochet baby toys and accessories.
Fortunately, during those years we were in Bangladesh, Bangladesh changed us and our perspective. I mean, we talk about colonialism in the sort of economic sense, but there's definitely a spiritual colonialism as well. And we were definitely bringing a version of Christianity that was distinct to our culture, the way that we had been raised. And we had this one perspective, and we felt that was the right way, and that we wanted to share that with other people. For us, even other Christians who believed differently than we believed were suspect as growing up. So like, oh yeah, they do this, or they allow this, or don't allow this. And it was, whether it was dancing or alcohol or whatever the thing was, there was always something that separated us from others. And made us a little bit holier in some way. So, and that happens within any tradition, I understand. So the sort of legalistic view of faith. But as we interacted with other people working and living in Bangladesh, and not just missionaries, people working within non-government organizations or NGOs, or working with the embassy, or and I'm talking now mostly about other expatriates, we begin to see, oh, yeah, we all are sharing this similar experience of learning a new culture and a new country. And then it was only a matter of time before we started looking at all the other people around us, the Bangladeshis, our colleagues, and seeing them in a new way as well, realizing we have something to learn, and we have not just a little bit, but we have a lot to learn. And it took some humility to realize that we just needed to step back and really take a stance of listening and just letting go of our own agendas. And we found that as we did that, I mean, obviously, if you go into a relationship and somebody has an agenda, it's uncomfortable, and it doesn't lead to authenticity or more depth in that relationship. And so as we let go of our agendas, we began to see the relationships that we had really start to flourish, and new relationships started, and relationships that were built on common interests, whether in my case that was with design and art and craft within Bangladesh, meeting other designers, photographers, going to galleries, and these organic relationships started to develop that were based on something that was authentic to who we were.
One of the terms I have often struggled with is the term expatriate versus immigrant and the power those terms imply. Can you help me unpack that term and the racial implications it implies?
Yes. And I'm very aware of that terminology. And I think when the word expatriate is used, often it is used for people who are temporarily in a country for the purpose of employment or bringing about some sort of social change or social good or something. Most of the time when you see an expatriate website or an expatriate this or expatriate that, blog, whatever, they're white people talking about their experiences in exotic lands.
Most definitely, right? It's like when I think of expatriates, I do wonder, like, if I was to go abroad and live in, any country. Most recently, I was in Zambia. If I was to go live in Zambia, I feel like people would not think of me as quintessential expatriate. I don't feel like I would belong in that category just because of the color of my skin.
Yeah, I don't like the word. I really don't like the word. And I don't like the associations with it. It has a whole scene around it that is exclusive. And I think, we actually have run into that very thing in Bangladesh when let's say there's an organization and they hire people or volunteers come from Brazil, from Zambia or wherever. And then there's some from North America or Europe, Australia. And there's this huge, they have trouble finding housing. They have trouble. The people of color have a much harder go at whatever it is. And they just aren't viewed as an expatriate who is given this privilege.
Most definitely. Bringing it back to Do Good Travel, during the Instagram Live, you mentioned you led mission trips and the trips ended up saving you. In your experience, what do mission trips look like?
So I first went to Bangladesh. That's how I ended up there. I went on a 3-month trip, and it was sort of exploratory to see if I'd want to work in Bangladesh. And I was very inexperienced, and that's another thing. I was not in any way educationally prepared to offer anything to Bangladesh except Jesus. So missionary groups use mission trips to I mean, for one part, it's to recruit people to come over a long term to find out if this is a situation that's workable for them. Like some cultures, people just don't thrive in. And so they want to sort of vet people. Other times it is more of, if it's a denomination and they want to have an opportunity for their kids to do some sort of service, then they plan a mission trip. And often those mission trips are the ones that really, they're more about the kids going than any change they're going to bring. And it's embarrassing. And when they go into another culture, they're not used to really listening and learning and being humble in a new culture. And so often you find the people that are working there long term, whether they're nationals who are living in that country or whether it's other missionaries, they're kind of left picking up pieces for a while after they leave, because often it's a whirlwind and very culturally insensitive. And there's always this question, because what happens is they take all these pictures, they go back and they tell people about their trip. Often this is out of high school. Sometimes they're still in high school. So, I mean, they are very immature.
Yeah. And what do those short-term mission trips look like?
So often it's project-based. So they'll say, oh, we're going to build a house. And so then they have all the materials there and they go build the house or make a driveway out of rocks. I mean, so it's often very physical type things that they're able to do. And maybe it's going to an English camp. So they're speaking conversational English with kids. Maybe sometimes they partner with a university and they work with let's say a church that's located in that city or that area of the country. So it's things that can be done by the team that makes them feel like they've done something, basically. So that makes it feel like their exotic trip around the world wasn't just a vacation, but that they got their hands dirty.
Yes. Okay. So, this is a really interesting point, which I always have struggled with. My understanding of this is, there's also a certain level of fundraising that takes place to go on these trips. And it kind of begs the question of, when you are doing all this fundraising, isn't it better to just take those funds and instead of using them for you to go, to invest them in the local community so they can employ local labor to create those roads or create those, that house?
Okay. So you have the one side of it is they will miss out on this experience if they just send the money. So it is about the people that are being sent. And I think often you'll have religious leaders realizing that interaction with other cultures is good for their kids and for maybe their church or their community. And they see the value in that. So there's that side of things. There is this, there's this, it's basically, I don't want to say racist, but it is racist in the sense that we know how to spend and use our money better than those people. And so we need to make sure that it's used properly. And I think that is a big hesitation on why we don't just hand funds over. Well, I grew up in a very small subculture, but I think it's true with any subculture that you trust your people. Grew up with that idea. And so to give outside of my own circles was kind of a big thing once I started realizing, oh, I can do research and I can give to where I see impact happening.
The Diversities and Disparities Project notes that most people in the United States live in residentially segregated communities that are not well integrated. When you spoke about short-term student trips, you mentioned how kids are often not aware of how to navigate in cultures other than their own. And I suppose it leads me to feel that these trips, even though they might be service-oriented, the benefits are still one-sided, and the person benefiting is the student, not necessarily the community.
The teams that I'm familiar with are primarily coming from, I should say, short-term teams, a couple weeks to a month, are often coming from a small church or a group of churches that is very monocultural, that live in a bubble of sorts. And often it's easier for white Christian Americans to think about helping brown people far away than to actually navigate what it means to live in a neighborhood where there's diversity, and to really think through all the issues and wrestle with the real problems that come up, whether it's problems in sort of dealing with your own emotion that comes up with, for me, it's my own racism. As it comes up, I have to deal with it. and I have to confront it, and it's uncomfortable, and it's not a place that I want to spend my energy, but I have to if I want to be authentic and honest with myself. It's interesting. People talk about this into their 40s and 50s, and they're like, oh, remember when we did this? And they have all these stories, and it's sort of romanticized in a way. And their kids think that they changed the world. There's this romanticization of it that there's no even contemplation that harm could have been done.
To me, that begs the question, what is it about going abroad and doing the work that is still so much more appealing than helping someone in your own community that could use an extra set of hands?
Wow. And this goes way beyond the whole faith conversation, but to NGOs and USAID. Why are they there? Why don't they just send money like you have? And I think it has to do with power and the power that money brings. So the organization I used to work with in Bangladesh, for a period of time, there was no, or at least very few and none in leadership, North American staff, or I should say white staff. So at times that was looked at as a detriment because they had a harder time raising funds, or I don't think they actually did, but I think that would happen with other organizations in that situation. But they didn't seem as valid because they didn't have this figurehead who looked like they knew what they were doing, which means they looked like they're white. Because people listen to me in ways that I was not used to, because while I was there, I was not that educated, and people would if I'd be in a room with a very educated Bangladeshi, they would defer to me and ask me the question, and I would feel like I need to give this answer, and I looking back, I cringe the people that could have answered that so much better.
This brings me to a really important point. I think it's incredibly important for us to understand and unpack our privileges. Your privilege gives you power to help dismantle systems of inequality. Unlearning colonial power dynamics and racism is an active process. It takes self-reflection, evaluating our internal biases, and how this manifests in the form of privilege. With your privilege comes a responsibility to build alliances with those within the community addressing the problem you're trying to help solve, and handing the mic to them using the privilege you hold because the result of what you are describing is internalized racism, in which marginalized communities have come to accept negative social beliefs and stereotypes of themselves, which in turn reinforces these colonial power dynamics, reinforces dependence, reinforces a level of accepting that we aren't as smart, important, or good enough as a white man.
Yeah. And the power is money often, because in a pragmatic situation, they realize that that relationship with that white person is a funnel where money can come into their organization from, even if they hate it. They realize that that's a reality. And for me, that's a power structure that needs to be addressed.
So how do we address it?
I don't know. It's so systemic because I mean, we've talked about imagery before and all of that, because these same white people that are going back to the States, realizing this weight of raising money is now on their shoulders. What do? They exploit images of brown people and raise the money quite effectively. They do the easiest thing, and it's just a cycle that really needs to be broken. And I think it has to do with giving up power. Yeah. I mean, that's basically what it is. And it's giving up power of being the one that distributes the money or the funds, of being the spokesperson, and of even like saying how things are done or whatever. I mean, yeah, there's this thought that North Americans know better. And when you say North Americans, it's very coded for being white North Americans mostly.
Yeah, and I would say this is not unique to Bangladesh. I do think it stems from racism, as you were mentioning earlier. Taking it back to voluntourism and mission trips, I'm curious, what role do you believe this need for purpose plays in people's journeys?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd almost make a difference between the sort of the mission trip thing that's because there's this whole spiritual aspect of that's sort of evangelistic. And so there's this fervor there that's often misplaced. I don't know, hormones among kids. I don't know what it is. There is a time of life where you're very idealistic, and you see people throwing themselves into politics or to communism or to being a missionary. I mean, like sometimes it's like that because you really need a purpose. And so I think that often happens. I mean, for me, I was running away from my queerness as a bi male and throwing myself into this. And so it seemed purposeful, and it seemed like, yes, I can lose myself in this. And I was actually running away from part of my own real identity. So,
and I think a part of that really comes out in photography, right? Like whenever you're going into these experiences with a camera, you cannot expect to have an authentic experience.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the whole history of photography and like National Geographic and their problematic portrayals of, otherization of brown and black people. I grew up with those images. So for me, that's what the other was. And it was all about like women with rings around their neck or big earring things or markings. I mean, for me, that's what the other was like. And it was exotic, and they were almost weren't portrayed as humans in a way.
Most definitely. And I think this in turn reinforces stereotypes. It reinforces the single narrative. It feeds on this colonial understanding of the savage versus the civilized, which is why I do think it is important to dismantle these topics and really dissect the layers of inequity that they are not just built on, but continue to flourish on. So thank you so much for joining me today. Any parting words you would like to share?
There's a lot to process, especially if you're navigating your own personal faith and thinking about the sort of from a Christian perspective, the theological implications of that are just, I mean, there's a lot to that. And we're having a moment here in the US right now that we need to be very careful about what types of things we export.
With that, I want to thank all the listeners for tuning in to today's episode and extend a special thank you to Neha, Lindsay, and Austin for joining me today and sharing their valuable insights. Please be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow each of them. To learn more about Art of Citizenry and for information on future webinars and workshops, please visit artofcitizenry.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Manpreet Kaura. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry podcast on your favorite listening app. From here in Seattle, sending positive and healthy vibes your way.